Hello and good evening. Good evening in our part of the world. It's really great to have spent today with you as we think and engage with notions of the city and urbanism, borders and migration. The reading sessions brief that we've given ourselves was to also reflect on the day's themes in ways that maybe also could be quite personal reflections that we mediate through texts of others. So each one of us in the team, curatorial team of Zeitz MOCAA, just kind of reflected and found something that relates. So I'm going to read two texts tonight from two sources. Been thinking very hard about my own subjectivity, my own whiteness, my own maleness, and navigating a really particular moment in history as well. So also thinking about the different psychological spaces that we occupy, also as a South African, and navigate. So the two texts that I have selected comes from this position. The first is a text by Ivan Vladislavić, who has written extensively about Johannesburg, an extraordinary writer, and I'm reading from a book called The Exploded View, a perspective that a character that occupies and navigates the city in a very particular way, very bureaucratic way. And the second text is by a friend or somebody that I actually engaged and met on Instagram, Eben Venter, who's a South African writer living in New Zealand, and a publication, a book called Green as the Sky is Blue, which maybe is more of a closer connection to some of my experiences. Not both of these texts deal necessarily with the city. Ivan's text more so, but Eben's text is very much about the navigation of psychological barriers and boundaries and borders and notions of travel. So without ado, I'm going to kick off with The Exploded View. Milton Mazibuko had been waiting for him outside the municipal offices in Kenton Park that morning. To tell the truth, he'd been expecting Bengu, the town clerk, but the great man was otherwise occupied. Mazibuko was the council official in charge of housing subsidies and deed registration on RDP projects like Hani View. He was a small round man in the cruel grip of fashion, thickly threaded shoes that made him look like a wind-up toy, a Nehru collar as tight as a tourniquet, a watch strap like a manacle on his wrist. He shook hands with Egan through the window of the hired car and then squeezed into the passenger seat. Although Egan knew every square centimeter of Hani View on the plans, he had never set foot on the site. Mazibuko gave him direction to the R562. They small-talked their way through the morning rush hour. How are things in Hani View? No, everything is going good. Mazibuko crossed his short legs in the narrow space in front of him and rested his knee against the dashboard. Rubicon finished another 15 houses last month. The people have moved in already. We had to put them in quick before there was even glass in the windows so that the squatters didn't get there first. So you're on schedule? Well, let's say we're not further behind schedule than that is strictly necessary. Any more blackouts? No, we sorted that out. It was a mix-up at the substation. The big problem is still with the toilets, I'm afraid. Half the houses don't have water. I mean, they've got pipes, but the people don't pay. And so when we cut them off, then they complain that the toilets won't work. That's why we call it waterborne sewage, folks. Some of them say they don't want a stinking toilet in the house anymore. A little bit late in the day to change their minds, don't you think? Very. Now, when they see the size of the water ball, they'd rather have a long drop in the yard. But when we offered them pit latrines to begin with, they were all up in arms. You remember the story, I didn't want a hole in the ground like a dog. I want a throne at the end of the passage. It's the same everywhere. If Janine could hear me now, he thought, this petulant tone. People are never satisfied. Exactly. I want to shit in style and pull the chain like the madam. Mazibuko gave another chubby laugh and Egan forced himself to join in. This kind of racial humor, or was it interracial humor, made him uncomfortable. He was never sure whether it was for his benefit or at his expense. When a black associate called him boss, he got a joke, give or take. But when the same associate called himself boy or bushy, Egan was never sure what was really going on. He saw the inevitable morning that lay ahead. Airborne sewage. He would have to take a whole lot of crap. It was one of his jokes. In this line of work, he would say, you have to take a lot of crap from the customer. You could call yourself a sanitary engineer if you liked. You could even be a sanitary engineering consultant. Sooner or later, everyone figured it out. You were in the shit business. From a distance, he thought there was a felt fire blowing smoke across the road, or something burning in the shack settlement he'd already noticed on the left. A patchwork place of the kind that still made him uneasy, no matter how often he came across it. But as they approached the crossroads, he saw that it was dust from the gravel that traffic between Honey View, on one side of the road and its informal satellite on the other, had scuffed over the tar. Both areas were fenced off from the main road, and there was just a single dirt track leading off to either side. The history of the area was complicated. The formal housing project had been an initiative of the Kempton Park Council, designed to take the overflow from Tembisa. 2,000 houses in the unusual unbending rows, a school, a community hall, a clinic. Louis Bengo had scarcely turned the soil for the foundations of the hall. An embarrassing moment. The ground was so hard he could not drive the blade of his spade into it, despite repeated blows from the heel of his bally slip-on. When an informal settlement sprang up on the opposite side of the road. Sprang up overnight, quite literally. The squatters had been dumped there by the Midrand Council on a tract of wasteland acquired from the province. Although Honeyview Extension 1, as it soon became known, was normally under the jurisdiction of Midrand, its proximity to the housing project on the other side of the municipal boundary effectively connected it to the neighboring council. The people from the shack sent their kids to school in Honeyview. They brought their broken bones and whooping coughs to the Honeyview clinic. They drew their water there and carried it back across the road in tins. If these people were ours, it would be different, ran one editorial in the Express. But they haven't been left on our, they've been left on our doorstep. Egan always found it strange to set foot for the first time in a place he knew from the plans. It was like folding out of 2 dimensions into 3. You could almost hear the creases popping as you broke through the barrier. Sometimes it was disenchanting. You had convinced yourself, looking at the neatly inked blocks on the paper, at the street names, the community facilities, the cookie-cutter trees, that the place was rather pleasant. You imagined gardens, shady avenues, and parks. And then you got there and found rows of impossibly small houses, not a leaf in sight, dust everywhere, shadowless walls, and the immense blue well of the sky which reduced the earth to sediment. At other times, the contrast between the flat world of the plan and the angular world of the township galvanized him. It was a beginning, wasn't it? You couldn't expect everything to change overnight. That was half the problem. It was like the pop song. People wanted it all, wanted it now for free. They turned into Honeyview. The main road had been graded recently and spread with gravel, which rattled against the underside of the car. The whitewashed pegs along the edge of the roadway, where a ridge of sand had been piled up by the graders, suggested that they would be tarring soon. It would make a difference. It would damp down the shifting sands, fix things in place. He turned left into a side street, left again, following the thrusts of Mazibuko's manacled hand, passed between rows of identical houses and drew up on the verge at the end of the block. The manhole cover, set in a pad of new cement as pale as a mushroom jutting out in the middle of the dusty street, was oddly reassuring. It suggested that something meaningful was going on below the surface. Pipes had been laid, a lasting claim had been embedded in the earth, and would not be rooted out too easily. By contrast, the freshly painted houses on all sides rested lightly on their bases, as if they had been set down there just a moment ago and could be brushed aside with the back of your hand. The electricity poles smelt of creosote. Everywhere, the earth had been raked until it was raw. In time, as people lived here and covered the soil with tar and stone and brick, the human presence would thicken. Permanence grew like a crust. Every layer added depth. In an established city where every square meter had been patched, paved, and repaved, an open ditch could throb like a wound. Workers clustered around a manhole, surrounded by striped barriers under a makeshift awning of green canvas, would remind him of nothing so much as surgeons in the operating theatre, gazing through pegged back skin at the exposed nerve. "Do you think it's too high?" Mazibuko asked, gesturing towards the cover. "Seems okay to me. Once the road's been surfaced, it should be level." Last week, a taxi driver ripped a sump out of this master on one of these on 10th Street. The people have been complaining. "That's hardly my fault," Egan wanted to say. "It's your responsibility to get the roads paved. Why doesn't the council just get on with it?" But he bit his tongue. They got out of the car and walked over to the manhole. Mazibuko tapped it with the toe of his shoe as he was trying to make his mark on it, just like Alzim Konto, who had scored his name and last month's date in the cement when it was wet. It was all too new for its own good. It needed time to settle and mature. And now I'm going to jump to, or go to a text by Eben Venter in his novel Green as the Sky is Blue, which follows the story of Simon Avent, who travels to distant places and where he encounters Nico, a black sprinter from South Africa, and they have an intimate encounter, which brings him back to a memory of a character growing up on a farm in rural South Africa, which brings him awareness of himself, and that held by his sexual partner. Once inside the kraal, the sheep were herded one by one through a smaller gate and pushed into a narrow passageway. A gang, we called it in Afrikaans. My father shouted at the men and at Vepi, fearing that a lamb might be trampled underfoot. In the meantime, outside the kraal, the rest of the flock had to be kept from straying too far. Mayoyo tethered his horse, and he and Tabo both had whips made of beautifully plaited tanned ox leather. They cracked the whips over the heads of the animals high up in the air, to this or that side of the flock, the tongue of the whip licking at the air full of dust that rose and settled and rose again in the confusion of the hooves of the ewes and the poor little lambs. The dust, I could smell it right then, heavy with white-brown earth and sheep dung freshly trampled. Skaapdrolletjies, small greenish black sheep droppings and dust. I buried my head in the pillow, the blue and white striped linen of the Hotel Villa Fontaine. So happy to have remembered this. It was such a beautiful thing that had come to me here in Tokyo, with this overlay so real of dust and droppings. Once the ewes were in the passage, they were examined one by one. Arnolds and November and the young Vepi were there in among the sheep. They worked their way along, starting with those closest to the gate. Arnolds was experienced and quickly spotted the greenish snot in a sheep's nose. My father and I stood on the other side of the crotch-high wooden fence, him with a doze gun to treat the ewes, while I held two other instruments, one of which was like a pair of pliers, with flat tip prongs that opened and closed. My job was to dock the lamb's tails while my father was on the lookout for blowfly and nasal worm. I had to fit a small rubber ring around the end of the pliers, slowly stretching it to open until the ring was wide enough to slip over the lamb's tail, and then letting it go so that the ring snapped closed around the base of the tail. The second implement was a pair of sheep shears for cutting the tail a quarter of an inch or so above the rubber ring. It was up to Vepi and me to conduct this little operation together. Vepi would scoop up a lamb in both arms and rest its tiny bum on top of the fence so that I could slip the ring around the base of its tail before docking it. The lambs had soft white wool, their eyes pure and pleading, utterly innocent they were. It was then that my arm touched Vepi's, the length of my forearm against the length of his, as he held the lamb in position, his skin covered in a layer of fine coral dust. I had blondish teenage hairs on my arm, while Vepi only had one or two, but his skin was actually hairless, textured from exposure to wind and sun. At most, it used a lick of Vaseline to smooth over the cracks. I knew very little about him, and there was no way I could have got to know anything more by sitting next to him on a couch, bare leg against bare leg, until a film of sweat formed from the touching. That sort of personal interaction wasn't possible. It would have overstepped the limits of relationships on the farm. I stood up from the big bed, took a bottle of green tea from the bar fridge, and went to stand at the window to watch the bullet trains. Afterwards, in the bathroom, as I pressed the little jackhammer button on the toilet, I realized Nico didn't want to reveal anything about his past, not a single thing about him growing up in this district of Zastron. And he didn't give a damn about anything concerning my past either. Then I started to understand him. I didn't even know Nico's surname. All that stuff about my arm touching the arm of young Vepi on the farm, nothing like that existed for him. And if he did, he wouldn't bring anything like that into the bedroom, where two guys were up for a good time. Okay, he had a preference for white guys, but that's as far as it went with him. And it was past all that shit. When he did touch me, he did so almost accidentally. He gave as much of himself as he wanted to or was able to. The next morning at breakfast, as I sipped my miso with its sprig of fresh green wakame, I saw him at reception checking out. I knew he'd come over to me. Hope to see you again sometime. You've got my number in Cape Town. His jet eyes glinted, and I noticed the fine creases at the corners as he glanced down at me, playful though not suggestive. He left some sweat from the palm of his hand on mine. He hated traveling, he told me. Then, typical of him, he gave me a quick hug, hard, before weaving his way among the slurping breakfast guests, his Adidas sports bag slung across his left shoulder. Thank you very much. The second text I saw a comment is from Eben Fenter's Green as the Sky is Blue, and I'll drop it in the comments in a moment. So thank you very much for joining us tonight. I would like to also just mention tomorrow's program, which is our concluding program for the Solidarity Summit, which is on the theme of radical practices, radical solidarity. At 4 p.m. South African Standard Time, we will have a conversation between Tuan Andrew Nguyen and Rasha Salti, which is being moderated by Koyo Kuo. Straight after that, we will have closing remarks by Tanazani Dlakama, our assistant curator at the museum, and myself, which will be followed by a film screening by Tuan Andrew Nguyen, which will be introduced by Tanazani Dlakama. The film is titled The Spectre of Ancestors Becoming, and then we will conclude with a reading by Phokeng Setai. So thank you once again for joining us tonight, and thank you very much, and look forward to the rest of the conversations. Good night.